A true story from Oregon. My daughter screamed, "You're not even family anymore." After I paid her husband's debt, I smiled, packed my bags, and took the title with me. My daughter's voice cut through the afternoon light like a sudden gust. "Mom, just pay off our debt. That's your job. But serve you right, I don't want to see your face here again." I had just arrived with my purse slung carefully over my shoulder, ready to offer help, not to face contempt. Before I could answer, she hurled another accusation. "Giadingima dabakan tiapte chin ku ne deng labafai suni ki truk." She slammed the kitchen table with frustration echoing off the walls. I stood quietly in the doorway, at 50 years of parenting still resting lightly on my frame. I am 78 now, a widow these last 3 years, living alone in the small cottage I built with my first husband in Ashland, Oregon. I had always been organized and generous, 40 years managing household finances, mornings filled with coffee and balance sheets, nights working on taxes to ensure our 3 children never felt a penny's fear. But that day, in my daughter Elena's home, I felt something I never expected. The hard sting of betrayal. Mark, my son-in-law, sat curled in a worn leather chair by the fireplace, watching us. His face was tight, arms crossed, jaw set. He had fallen behind on substantial debts, credit cards, a business loan, and a lien from a contractor who felt cheated. Elena had pleaded on the phone, voice trembling, asking me to help, before it all unraveled. I considered it a mother's instinct, to protect, to care, to stand when others faltered. I agreed. I transferred savings I'd set aside for emergencies, a simple act of love. But when I walked through their front door bearing goodwill, I was met with this. Elena stood over me now, throat tight with anger and fear. I'd never seen her like this. I realized the severity of the moment. The fragile thread I had mistaken for gratitude had snapped. I stepped forward to sit, but someone had placed a small wooden stool at the kitchen's edge. Low, sparse, unwelcoming. I lowered myself onto it while the rest gathered in plush seats around the room. The stool felt foreign and unfair under me. My hands rested on my lap, cool and steady. I touched my wedding band, my husband's gift on our 45th anniversary, the gold worn smooth from decades of warmth. I remembered how he once smiled when he called me the rock of our family, how he trusted me to make every decision alongside him. Elena's voice softened as she leaned forward, but not kindly. "Mi tong la trukot, but now? You're causing a mess." When she spoke the word me, it felt sharp and empty. I understood then. They no longer saw me as a mother, but as an obstacle. Mark chimed in quietly, his words calm but harsh. "We will support you, mother, but only if you give up that place by the lake." My heart clenched. That lake house? The one with lavender bushes and a porch swing he built with his own hands? It held our history. My children had grown there. They had carved initials into the railings. I had booked their prom photos in the fields beyond the dock. To me, it was sacred space. Elena shook her head. "If you insist on doing this, take your money and your memories elsewhere. We want peace, not drama." Their demands landed heavy. I must choose between being allowed to live under their roof or preserving my own sanctuary by the lake. And in that moment, I felt a new ache, not death, not the ache in my bones, but the ache of being erased. I looked around the room. Plush sofa, carved dining chairs, family portraits on the walls. Only I seemed out of place, seated on a low stool in an awkward corner. I swallowed the urge to cry or to throw back a fierce retort. Instead, I pressed my lips together and waited. I watched my daughter's face, flushed with righteous anger, and my son-in-law's cool detachment. They sat together but seemed equally determined. I breathed deeply, noticing how each breath held a different weight now. Love felt brittle, sacrifice felt invisible, and their expectations had transformed generosity into guilt. I closed my eyes briefly, gaining composure. Their verdict had been spoken, their conditions laid bare. I could stay and obey, or I could leave and remember. When I opened my eyes again, I saw surprise flicker across Elena's face. They seemed to expect tears or panic. I offered neither. I stood, steadily brushing my skirt smooth. I picked up my purse calmly from the counter edge. I looked at my daughter and son-in-law as though seeing them for the first time. As adversaries rather than kin. There was no speech left that could reach them at this moment. Without a word, I turned and walked toward the door. I paused with a quiet click of the lock behind me. The light outside was soft and forgiving, the wind still. I stepped onto the porch and held the screen door closed behind me, not slamming it, but sealing it with meaning. I did not look back. I did not cry. The fade of footfalls in my own home sounded louder than anger. I walked into the afternoon, empty-handed except for the bag I had brought. I felt the sun on my face. Warm, honest, unjudging. The road before me stretched toward memory and home and a choice I would soon make. The moment I stepped away from their front door, I thought the storm had passed. But when I got home, I realized the real hurricane was waiting for me. Not outside, but within the walls I thought of as sanctuary. The afternoon light had dimmed by the time I reached my kitchen. I set down my purse and realized I could taste grief, thick and metallic with betrayal. I should have known. It rarely arrives at the front door. Mostly it lodges itself behind your sternum. That night I could not sleep. I lay awake, remembering the wooden box I kept on the mantel in Portland, tucked behind old wedding photos. It was small, a dark walnut box with brass hinges, polished by hands that treated it like treasure. Inside were two things: a simple handwritten IOU from Mark, dating back to 2016, promising to repay the money I had lent him when his business collapsed, and a folded letter from that year, where he had thanked me for my help, his words smudged from the tear I had let slip on the envelope flap. I closed my eyes, and the next day morning light brought purpose. I drove back to their house, this time with intention. I rang the doorbell. Alina answered, surprise in her eyes. "You left something behind," I said, voice gentle. She frowned. "I don't need anything more," she responded coldly, shutting the door. I sighed, knowing they didn't want the box, but it still belonged to me more than it ever belonged to them. I placed it back in my car, under the seat, along with a taste of humiliation I refused to swallow. 2 days later, they called me. They wanted me back to resolve things. I found myself sitting again on the low wooden stool, face taut with weariness. Elena said, "We thought about what happened. Money aside, we miss you." My silence was their cue. But before any false reconciliation could begin, Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He reached for the walnut box and opened the lid. I watched his shoulders straighten as he pulled out the folded letter and IOU, then pressed both into his palm. He folded his own arms and said, "Why we still keep mistakes from the past. Stop living in the past, Ma." He dropped the whole thing, box, papers, memories, into the trash can a moment later with a careless flick. The box hit the floor with a hollow clatter. The sound echoed around me as if it were broadcast. There was something sacrilegious in that trash can, the tangible proof of trust, of thankfulness, of a promise. And they emptied it onto the floor like litter. I felt my breath catch. I blinked, and tears welled up. I had come seeking reconciliation. They had thrown away a commitment I had honored. I closed my eyes again and breathed deeply. My oldest daughter, Emily, stirred beside me in the kitchen, confused, quiet, and Elena placed a gentle arm around her, muttering something I didn't catch, but meant to conceal the cruelty. Inside I felt the tears, but I knew I could not cry. Not today, not when they needed to see I was unbreakable. I forced a slow exhale, pressing my lips together into silence. "I will take these back," I said quietly, pointing at the scattered pieces of wood and paper. They raised their eyebrows. Had they expected tears? I gathered the box and ruined letters with calm fingers. A few flecks of wood broke off, but I kept the IOU intact in my pocket. I left before they could suggest I stay. I returned to my home with all 5 fingers tight around that letter, eyes still wet, but posture unbowed. The world was quiet. No storm raged here, only a pounding in my own head. For the rest of the day, I replayed every memory associated with that box. I remembered how I had polished its surface every Sunday, noting the grain. I remembered reading the letter in dim light and crying tears of joy because it felt like acceptance. And I remembered folding the letter many times, wondering if time would ever demand fairness in return. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. I scheduled a meeting for the following week and asked for documents on transferring the lakeside house to a trust. I felt older, yes, but also sharpened by the injustice. My spine straightened. and I saw clearly what they had tried to do: erase my past, silence my sacrifice, decimate my dignity. They had taken my money and forgotten the rest. Now they would not take everything. The next morning I walked into a garden center. I bought lavender seedlings, deep purple that reminded me of that lake home. I planted 15 of them in pots by my front door. I watered them with care, whispering to them as if they were my friends. "We will grow," I said. Then I added the box and letter to my shelf, cleaned, polished, returned to its reverence. I replayed that moment with Mark, tossing away my trust and pride, thinking, perhaps, I would crumble. But I realized I had already chosen not to. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table writing in my journal. If they valued nothing, they had proven themselves not worthy of my generosity. I will protect what is mine, not out of spite, but out of justice. I pressed my pen into the page and lingered on the ink's permanence. Then I added, I will not be erased. Each sentence felt heavier than the last, but they weren't weights, they were anchors. By week's end, I had the first draft of the trust documents. I had researched lakeside property laws, grantor trust mechanics, personalized clauses. I had a plan to ensure no one could reach the house unless I allowed it. I felt energy flow back into me, each paragraph a sign of rising. When Mark texted to ask if they could talk, I replied, I will reach out when I am ready. Silence held power, and I intended to let it echo. I went to bed that night with a quiet purpose, the lavender blooming softly outside my window. They had crossed a line, and I would cross them. Not with anger, but with carefully placed protection that even they could not ignore. I woke early that morning, before sunrise, and padded into our small bathroom. I reached into the cedar-lined closet and pulled out the pink fur robe. Its satin lining slightly faded, but the fur still soft and comforting. My husband had bought it for me on our 50th anniversary trip to Palm Springs. He said it reminded him of spring mornings when everything seemed possible. I slipped it on, feeling the familiar weight of solitude and memory settle on my shoulders. When I reached the living room to pour my tea, Alina and Mark were already seated at the kitchen table, their faces lit with muted tension. My heart fluttered. I hadn't expected company this early. Yet there they were, and in that moment I realized the pink robe was more than fabric. It was history, emotion, and connection. Elena looked up and her gaze tightened. "Are you really going to wear that?" she asked, voice chilling. "Do you think it's the 50s? You should dress like a normal old person." Her words struck with more force than any hurricane wind. The rose-colored fur suddenly felt out of place, like a lullaby sung to a room now deaf. I sipped tea without speaking. Mark added, not looking up, "You need to stop pretending this is still your era." I stood silent. A half-hour passed. No one spoke. The pink robe sat on my frame like a banner. They left later for work, Elena without a glance, Mark without a hug. I heard the front door click shut and I sat down at the table, forehead resting on my folded hands. Tears started to fall, slow and wet. I remembered those spring mornings he whispered to me as we drank coffee on the porch. I remembered the first time I wore that robe alone on Christmas Eve while he wasn't feeling well. It had smelled like hope and fresh blooms. Now, the fur smelled like judgment, but then something shifted beneath the sorrow. I straightened, wiped my tears, and gazed out the window at the flower beds I had planted. The tulips and crocuses poked through soil, blooming despite the chill, tiny promises of resilience. I rose, walked carefully upstairs, and changed into jeans and a warm sweater. I slipped the pink robe onto the armchair in my bedroom. Tomorrow, I thought, I can take it back for good. Later, I found the trust documents in their folder and sat with my pen. I remembered our vows as I wrote each clause, memories not rooted in a house or money, but in protecting what matters. When evening came, I sat in the now empty living room, the pink fur draped like a ghost of the past. I thought of Alina's eyes full of disdain. I imagined her as a girl dancing in the summer dusk, shy beneath that same fur, when the robe first arrived. I did not cry again, but I did smile softly, because a memory, even repurposed for protection, cannot be erased by contempt. And so I folded the robe neatly and placed it in the cedar chest beneath our wedding photo. It would remain until I decided its final rest. I whispered to myself, "Spring comes again. Because even in judgment, there is hope. Even when they forget the season, I will bloom. I closed the door to my bedroom behind me and leaned against it, taking a quiet moment to breathe. The words from earlier that day still echoed in my mind, but something behind those echoes stirred. A resolve. I moved across the room to the antique desk he had carved for me decades ago, its wood polished by our hands over the years. I opened the desk drawer and extracted a thin, leather-bound folder. Inside were the trust documents I had quietly prepared 3 months ago, every clause and letter notarized, every signature in place except mine. I set the paperwork on the desk and opened the flask of purple ink, the same shade my husband used when composing his love letters in the evenings. When the world was young and our hearts even younger, I uncapped a fountain pen and dipped it into the rich color. As the nib touched the page, it felt like I was channeling both memory and purpose. His love and my resolve, combined in ink that carried decades of emotion. I signed my name at the end of the trust agreement, letting the ink flow deliberately. On that fold of paper was more than legal language. It was a statement of self-preservation. The contrast felt beautiful, yet bitter. The same color ink that once whispered winding poems of devotion now sealed an agreement to protect those memories and what remained of my independence. When I finished, I closed the folder and held it to my chest. I whispered to the silence, "They will read this and understand. I am listening. I may be old, but I am not helpless." Then I called my lawyer's office. "Hello, this is Eleanor Harper," I said, voice calm. "I am ready to sign and fund my living trust. I have already completed the required documents. Please schedule a time." The woman on the line, Emily, did not sound surprised. "Yes, Mrs. Harper. I have everything prepared as you directed. We can meet tomorrow morning at your home, or you can come to the office." "Please come here," I replied, at 9:30. I hung up and set the phone down with purpose. That evening, I sat in the living room near the small lamp. I poured myself chamomile tea and sat with my hands around the warm cup. My emotions felt muted but significant, determination anchored by love. The purple ink in the folder beside me glistened softly in the lamplight. I recalled that spring morning so long ago when he had handed me that pen, laughing at how my handwriting would blossom with color. It seemed that color had blossomed again, this time into protection. As I prepared for bed, I arranged my schedule in my journal. Schedule call to realtor for house appraisal. Confirm lawyer coming tomorrow morning to witness trust. Draft letter to children explaining change once trust is executed. Plant new lavender seedling at garden's north corner. Organized, deliberate, private. My hands shook only slightly as I made each note, but my heart felt strong. The next morning at 9:30 sharp, the lawyer arrived, stepping inside the door with professional calm. We greeted briefly, and I led her upstairs to my study. I poured fresh tea, and we settled at the desk. She moved through the pages, initialed each change, and watched me sign again, this time under her witness, still in purple ink. "Everything is in order," she said, closing the folder. "The trust is funded, and the document has priority date from 3 months ago." I nodded. "Thank you. Please file it." She smiled. "You've done well to set this up ahead of time. Many clients wait too late. I learned years ago," I said softly. "When a lifetime is shared, so should the protections." She packed her bag and left, and I closed the door behind her. I felt neither triumphant nor guilty, only quiet satisfaction. I stood at the window and looked out at the pale sky and swaying branches. It had rained this morning, leaving the world washed clean. I thought of the trust document folded neatly in my desk drawer, secure and hidden like a secret armor. I went downstairs and brewed fresh coffee. As the machine hissed, I thought about how little they knew, not about the trust, not about the purple ink, not about the fact that I had taken careful steps to ensure this was not sudden but planned. I pulled gloves onto my hands, grabbed garden shears, and stepped outside. In the side yard, I knelt beside a bare patch of earth and dropped in lavender seedlings, 8 in total, 7 for the grandchildren and 1 for me. A reminder that memory is rooted, visible, and alive. The wind rustled through the leaves overhead, and I could almost hear him whispering, "You are never alone." Inside, the sun had come out, leaving gentle warmth behind in each room. I poured another cup of coffee and sat at the dining table, sipping slowly. My gaze softened at the photograph of my husband on the mantel, him smiling on our golden anniversary, the pink robe draped behind me. The scene felt complete, a new chapter beginning, bound by love and integrity. I was ready for whatever came next, and they were yet to learn the lessons of memory wielded with care and a quill imbued with purple ink. Life settled into an uncanny stillness in the days following the signing of the trust. The house seemed to breathe easier, as if relieved that its future had been quietly secured. For me, each morning began the same. I woke with the sun, dressed in comfortable layers, and made my way downstairs. I boiled water for oatmeal, chopped fruit, and sat by the bay window watching sparrows flit among the backyard shrubs. While I ate, I traced my finger along the page of the daily newspaper, checking for financial news, anything related to elder law reforms that had been circulating lately. Oddly, I felt a sense of calm that hadn't been there for weeks. The world outside buzzed with tension, but in that moment my world was a small sanctuary built on routine. I tidied up the kitchen, wiped the counters, and washed the dishes. I could almost taste the irony. I had once cleaned counters for my own mother when she aged, and now I found peace in these small domestic motions. Outside, the garden called. I slipped on gardening gloves and tended to the lavender I had planted. The soft scent, purple petals bobbing in the breeze. It was simple, but it grounded me. Each stem I pruned felt like a promise of continuity, a gentle insistence that life endures. When I returned indoors, I wrote a brief entry in my journal. Today, tension continues. They called my lawyer again. They expect a resolution by Friday. Math aside, their deadline holds no meaning. I choose stillness. I underlined the final sentence 3 times. It reminded me who I was. Not a reaction to their demands, but a quiet force. Elena and Mark had been in 6 separate calls with my lawyer over the past week. I learned this not from them, but from the guiding updates emailed to me. They demanded the transfer of the lakeside cottage to joint ownership. They insisted the trust was invalid. They implied I'd misled them, or worse, misrepresented my intentions. These were their opening tactics. I could offer them nothing but silence. No rebuttal, no emotional plea, just quiet. I'd prepared lunch, a pot roast and mashed potatoes, with steamed green beans I had picked just this morning. I set places for 2 as if they might return for dinner. Of course they didn't. I ate my meal slowly, savoring the flavors, allowing peace to wash over me. Each evening I chose a walk through my neighborhood. I followed the same path I took with my husband on Sundays. The street was lined with maple trees, leaves glowing amber in the fading daylight. I thought of conversations we had shared, of how he would clip my fingernails after I worked long hours. I realized that even as grief still pricked at me, I had reclaimed a sense of independence I thought I had lost. Inside, I began cleaning and filing. On the sideboard, I placed a clean copy of the trust document beneath the framed wedding photo. I caught sight of the purple ink, my signature glowing under the light as a reminder. The trust was invisible to them, but not to me, not to its purpose. They continued their campaigns. Elena texted earlier this morning, "We need to discuss the house. Call me." I did not respond. Hours passed before I typed a final 1-word reply. Soon. I meant it with the deliberate measuredness that comes from knowing every move has momentum. By midweek, a realtor called. They wanted to appraise the cottage, probably for refinancing or sale. I said calmly, "The property is not available for sale." The reverence in my voice was stronger than their confusion. I tended to the house. I dusted the living room china set and polished silverware. I laundered sheets and fluffed pillows. The house was mine to shape, even if they refused to acknowledge it. They had plenty of rage, emails delivered in all caps, voicemail notes loaded with half-laced threats. But I preserved silence. It was a shield. One evening, I prepared myself a cup of chamomile, brewed gently in a white teapot. I poured into my favorite mug, hand-painted with lavender sprigs. I carried it to the porch and sat in what used to be our favorite rocking chair. It creaked softly as I leaned back, balancing the mug on my lap. The air smelled faintly of pine and fresh rain. I closed my eyes. Far below, the lake shimmered between tree branches. I thought of Elena's hot words, Mark's accusations, and somewhere deep in me I felt an anchor holding firm. A week later, I found the mailman lingering at my gate. He handed me an envelope thick with forms, Legal notices, so aggressively worded they would have made my stomach knot years ago. I read them, felt the familiar prickle of alertness, but then closed the envelope and returned it to their box. Another step completed, another draft finished, another test passed. I pressed my pen into my journal again. They speak, I wait, the cottage stands. It was honest. It was me. That night, I fell asleep with the window just slightly ajar. A breeze drifted in and carried the sound of a single owl calling across the water. It was comforting, as if the night itself was alive and watching. I fell asleep with trust in ink, trust in roots, and trust in the quiet resolve of an old woman who refused to bend. Tomorrow would come, and so would they. But I would still be here, same porcelain floors, same lavender candles, same steady breath echoing through the hallways. That was the peace I chose. That was my front before the storm. The phone rang softly, just as I was finishing breakfast. I pressed the speaker button and heard the calm voice of my lawyer, Ms. Preston. Eleanor, I'm calling on behalf of Elena's attorney. They're preparing to sue for joint ownership of the lakeside property. My teacup paused mid-air. The waters had moved beyond tension into legal hostility. Under which grounds? I asked steadily. Your daughter is claiming undue influence, Ms. Preston explained. She argues that when you paid off Mark's debts using joint savings, you violated some agreement, and now she wants to compel sale or transfer. Very well, I replied. Let her proceed. Then Ms. Preston's tone shifted. There's something you may not know. The cottage title is no longer under your name or theirs. It was transferred into the trust you created 3 months ago. Silence. I swallowed, nonplussed. Good. Later that day, I received the expected summons, a thick envelope with stamped notices and court dates. I placed them beside the purple signature on the trust folder. 2 days later, Elena arrived without knocking. She barged in, voice trembling with rage. You expect me to take this lying down? Beside her, Mark looked drawn, but resolute. They'll be at the courthouse on Monday, she spat. Do you realize what you've done? I set my mug down with careful calm. I realized that your claim is no longer valid. The title is in trust. It doesn't belong to anyone else, I said, my voice quiet. Elena's face broke. Are you going to die alone in that cold house? Her words landed like stones. I inhaled slowly. I smiled softly. No, I said, gaze steady. I live with memories, and you will live with a copy of me without a soul. That phrase hit her hard. The hurt in her eyes flickered with realization. She couldn't trample my memories, but she had attempted to. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived. I stood at the courthouse steps, cane in hand, with Ms. Preston by my side. Cameras from the local news station were streaming live, but I avoided blinking into their lenses. I was here not for spectacle, but to assert a quiet dignity. Inside the courtroom, I took the stand. Elena's lawyer questioned me about the debt repayment, the date the trust was created, and my intentions. I answered simply and firmly. I set up the trust with purple ink 3 months ago to protect what's mine. I never intended to cut them out, but I did not give them ownership. When the lawyer mentioned undue influence, I shook my head slightly. I offered help. When help is refused with betrayal, one learns the lesson of silence. Later, Ms. Preston produced the title transfer documents, dated and notarized, with my signature in purple ink. The judge reviewed them, tisked softly, and said, Based on the presented trust, it appears the property is not part of the assets subject to this suit. The bench's gavel echoed. Case dismissed. Property excluded from dispute. Outside, reporters flashed their lights, but I only saw Elena's face. Pinched, disappointed, distant. Elena spoke into a microphone, voice raw. I never wanted to go to court with my mother. I just wanted fairness. I listened, gathered my purse, and turned toward her. Fairness is not always ownership, I answered calmly. Fairness is knowing what legally belongs to you, or not. She glared, mouth tight. Mark stepped forward, apologetic but stiff. I nodded once, brief and measured. That evening, I sat on the porch, gazing at the lake. The air was crisp, and the setting sun burned pink across the water. I closed my eyes and remembered spring mornings with my husband and children, chasing ducks by this shore. A text buzzed softly in my pocket. "It was Elena," she wrote. "I'm sorry for the courtroom storm. I see now that you were prepared. I lost sight of memories." I stared at the message, then set the phone aside. I did not reply. Deep inside I felt peace, not triumph. The trust worked as I intended, not to punish, but to preserve. The title remained under my control, and ultimately, with my chosen steward, I filed the court dismissal papers and returned a copy of the trust extract to the county recorder's office, just to be certain. Days later, as twilight crept over the lake, I walked down to the dock. The purple lavender by the path rustled in a gentle breeze. I clenched my cane handle, silent but full of purpose. I had protected something deeper than wooden beams and inherited equity. I had preserved the right to my own memories and shaped how they would live beyond me. And in doing so, I had shown Elena and Mark what it meant to treat a lifetime like the gift it was, not a burden. The day after the courthouse victory dawned bleak and gray, reflecting the heaviness that lingered around the house. I stayed in bed a moment longer, listening to the slow hush of morning rain. A gentle peace filled my room, but out there, I knew, storms still raged. I descended the stairs and paused at the foot of the hall. Sunlight forced its way through drawn curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing like silent witnesses. I took a deep breath, then walked to the coat closet and retrieved a small suitcase. I began to gather my belongings, not with haste, but with deliberate calm. Elena and Mark had not spoken to me since their defeat in court. I had offered no embrace, no words of forgiveness or victory, just silence. In their texts, they accused me of orchestrating a plan without trust or heart. A wisp of regret had appeared in Elena's voicemail, but it was restrained by pride. I had not replied. I came down to the kitchen to pack plates of leftover roast and mashed potatoes, carefully wrapping them in tinfoil. I placed them in paper bags, writing "for whomever stays" in my tidy hand. I added lavender sachets into the suitcase, mementos of hope. I stepped into the living room and surveyed the empty spaces, the sofa still plush, the photographs preened and unchanged. Everything sat intact, as if frozen in a moment awaiting someone who would not return. I pressed my palm against the bay window, the reflection showing a woman who had changed. I smiled softly at the silhouette with the suitcase by her side. I walked to the small study where the trust folder lay. I opened it and inhaled the scent of paper, the purple ink still glinting. I closed it deliberately and slid it into an interior pocket of my blazer. I packed my purse and leaning cane into the suitcase. I took the keys to the lakeside cottage from my top drawer. They were engraved and had been my husband's, along with the small carved keyring he had made for me. I placed both in the suitcase, then zipped it closed. I looked around one last time and nodded, a gesture of acceptance, closure, and intent. The driveway felt longer than it used to. My car pulled onto the street, tires humming in steady rhythm. I drove without haste, glancing at the trees where leaves were turning. My mind was clear. I was not leaving in haste or because of defeat. I was launching the next phase. Hours later, I reached the lakeside property. I parked at the path's edge and walked to the front porch. The lavender I had planted remained small but thriving, and the scent drifted through open windows. I unlocked the front door and stood inside, looking around. I remembered the laughs that once filled this space, the echoes of grandchildren's footsteps, my husband's quiet presence reading the evening paper. Now it was mine to protect, not to rule, but to share wisely. My nephew's daughter Rachel was waiting by the porch rail. She was 19 now, tall, earnest, and someone I trusted. Several months earlier, I had spoken to her over tea, saying, "Rachel, can I trust you to protect this place? It means more than walls. It holds our family's roots." Rachel had nodded. "I promise, Grandma." And now she stood there with a single key in her palm. I placed the suitcase on the floor and reached for her hands. "It's yours now," I said, voice soft but firm. "Look after it. The trust protects it, but you carry its soul." She pressed the key against my palm, eyes gleaming. "I will. I swear." We spent the afternoon walking the grounds. We trimmed small shrubs, pulled weeds around the lavender, and swept the porch. Every breeze felt like connection to memory, justice, responsibility. "Come visit whenever you need refuge," I told her. "Not as an obligation, but as a home." Rachel smiled, and I saw in her the balance of strength and tenderness I had once believed gone. Later, I walked to the mailbox and pulled a small bundle of letters, newsletters, community flyers, and a typed letter addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Harper. It was an invitation. Please join us for the Lakeside Community dedication this fall. I smiled and tucked it into my purse. I returned to my car. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror to see Rachel standing by the house, her hand over her heart. I felt a peaceful ache, a scar healed by trust. Back in Portland that evening, I retrieved my mail and set my suitcase by the door. I changed into a simple dress and shoes before stepping out to dinner at a neighborhood cafe. I sat alone at a window seat, sipping tea and watching strangers. I felt neither defeated nor triumphant, just whole. Days turned into weeks. The courthouse case remained closed, the trust unchallenged, their anger softened into silence. I received no more messages from Elena, but a small card came in the mail. I hope you are well. I understand now. I considered responding, but I didn't. Silence was still my choice. Each morning I woke and followed my routine. Breakfast by the window, garden watering, legal consultations for Justice by the Lake, my nonprofit that would be launched soon. I prepared initial documents, scheduled a board meeting for next month, and drafted outreach letters to local elder centers. The house at the lake was meant to host community elder workshops and respite retreats. Rachel would help coordinate. In the stillness of afternoons, I practiced mindfulness, the same moments of calm that had carried me through betrayal. I thought of the scar inside, the wound left by those who loved me most. But I also felt the strength that came from knowing it would not define me. One morning, the front page of the local paper featured a headline, "Widowed Grandma Wins Court Reprieve in Family Feud Over Lakeside Cottage." I read the article over my oatmeal. The reporter had quoted me saying, "It was never just a house. It is inheritance of memory, not ownership." I placed the paper beside me, not for pride, but as proof that stories like mine matter. That night, under my porch light, I pulled my purple fountain pen from its case. I wrote a note to my nonprofit's future board. Let us never allow age or love to erase dignity. The summer passed. Harvest came. The lavender near the lake bloomed taller than I expected. On warm evenings, Rachel and I walked the property, talking about plans for the fundraiser, about elder rights, about resilience. Then the invitation came. "Mrs. Harper, would you be our keynote speaker at the Empowering Elders Gala?" I accepted, feeling the last threads of isolation untangle. The day before the gala, I drove to the lake to ensure everything was set. I walked the rooms, dusted the small conference space we had prepared, and watched the sunset turn the water gold. I held the keys in my hand and whispered, "We did this." Standing before an audience that evening, some much older, others younger, I spoke. For decades, I called my family first when things were broken. But one afternoon, they chose contracts over connection. I chose not bitterness, but boundaries. And with paper, pen, and purple ink, I chose to protect what no one else respected, dignity rooted in memory and justice. I paused as the room held quiet, then ended, "Our scars are not wounds. They are reminders. Let us live brave." The applause followed, steady and warm. That night, I returned to the lakeside house. The old walls held a promise. Peace, not possession. I placed my journal on the mantel beneath the wedding photograph. Then I stepped onto the porch and watched the stars gather above the still lake. I breathed in gratitude, pain, and possibility. The chapter was not finished, it was beginning. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as I stepped out onto the porch of my lakeside home. The lavender patches I planted weeks ago still held their deep, regal purple, nodding in the breeze. The house looked unchanged, its porch railing still worn in spots, the lawn slightly overgrown, but I saw it differently now, not as a relic of my past, but as a seed for the future. It began as a quiet decision. After the court victory, I mulled over how to give the house a purpose beyond memory. I remembered how many elderly neighbors felt isolated, unsure of where to turn when family betrayed them or legal issues loomed. I decided that this place, my old sanctuary, could serve as a powerfully gentle resource, a space where seniors could gather, learn, and feel respected. Thus was born Justice by the Lake, a nonprofit dedicated to elder legal advice and financial empowerment. I contacted a former colleague, a retired attorney specialized in elder law, and he agreed to volunteer once a month. We painted the sunroom fresh white, installed a long table, and equipped the wall with bookshelves filled with legal workbooks, guidebooks on elder rights, and binders of community resources. Our first workshop was humble. 6 seniors from the local town came with questions about power of attorney, property rights, and trust establishment. We met in casual comfort, seated around the table with paper cups of herbal tea. I opened by sharing my story, our family storm, the court, and the purple ink signature. I spoke softly, but the group leaned in. This was not just advice, it was lived truth. Over the next few weeks, word spread. Articles appeared in regional newsletters and on small TV news segments. The place became, unexpectedly, a catalyst. Younger attorneys volunteered, librarians offered to bring legal pamphlets. The local senior center began scheduling buses to bring people over. The house pulsed with energy, quiet, earnest, hopeful energy that felt like purpose. On a mild summer afternoon, we held our first estate planning fair on the lawn. Tables set with pamphlets, lawyers answering questions, herbal tea and cookies. My husband's old rocking chair sat beneath the big maple, and people, some shaky on walkers, others sharp-eyed in crisp shirts, came to ask, "Do I need to update my will?" Or, "What happens if I marry later in life?" And I helped them, with the calm, steady presence of someone who had lived the questions themselves. I watched as Olivia, my lawyer friend, guided a gentleman through the choice between a will and trust, as lighter skirts of lavender brushed his sleeve like a benediction. Over and over I heard the same grateful tone. "Thank you, I feel more at ease." One morning, camera crews arrived for a local public service announcement. The producer asked me to stand in the sunroom. With the lake visible behind me, I stood straight, wearing a simple white blouse, and looked down at the paperwork on the table. The flashing light of filming meant the moment had come. They called rolling, and the camera began. I looked into the lens and spoke slowly, deliberately. "They think old women don't know the law, but I don't just know it, I wrote it." I paused. I was a mother. Now, I am the judge. The silence that followed felt heavy with promise. I signed the broadcast-length message with a hand that 3 decades of nurturance had steadied, then clasped my purse, camera lights dimming behind me. The video played on regional social media. Comments poured in. "You gave me hope. Thank you for your courage. Justice at last." That evening, Rachel and I sat on the porch swing, listening to crickets and watching stars glimmer on the lake. She sipped tea from a travel mug labeled Justice by the Lake. I handed her the framed copy of the broadcast from the promo. She smiled widely. "They'll remember this place now." I nodded. "Let them remember the work, too." I paused. "I feel strong again. Thank you for standing with me through every quiet betrayal and bold decision. If this story reminded you of something, your mother's silence, your grandmother's strength, or your own unspoken battles, then remember this: we are not finished. At Grandma True Stories, we honor women who lived the pain, but never let it define them. Women who signed with purple ink, who planted lavender over grief, and who turned the final chapters of their lives into a legacy of justice. If you believe these voices matter, if you believe elder women deserve not just care, but respect, please subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Every view, every share, every comment helps amplify the stories they once tried to bury, because the past doesn't fade when it's remembered out loud. Click that subscribe button, because revenge has no expiration date and wisdom never withers.